What's going on, family? And welcome back here to another week on Guns and Butter with your favorite cousin, Kinda G. Y'all, I'm super excited for this week's case because it's been a minute since we've covered a serial killer. And this one is gonna be good, okay? Because this man is known as a Sunday morning slasher. And like good old Samuel Little, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Between 1974 and 1982, while living in both Michigan and Texas, he hunted down young women. And he didn't necessarily come with a plan in advance. He would just spot a woman, follow her, and then strike within seconds. No warnings, no words. Sometimes the victim never even saw him coming. His attacks were fast, brutal, and random. So random that the police struggled to predict where he would strike next. In Ann Arbor, a string of killings on Sunday mornings earned him that nickname, the Sunday morning slasher. But if y'all are ready to hear about this one, go ahead, cozy on up, because I know it's cold outside. Get some hot cocoa, some popcorn, whatever you need, and let's dive in.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
All right, cousins. So this week, I'm going to take the case back to the end, and then I'll loop y'all back around to the beginning where it all started. On May 23rd, 1982, 19-year-old Lori Lister was walking from her car to her apartment just like any other morning. But this particular morning, she never saw what was coming to her. Out of nowhere, a man jumped out of the bushes behind her, grabbed her from behind, and with hands as big as can be, he wrapped them around her neck and squeezed as hard as he could. Then he asked her, "Where do you live?" And Lori nervously pointed to a second-floor apartment. Then he asked, "Is anybody else there?" And she says no. But that wasn't entirely true, because her roommate, 18-year-old Melinda Aguilera, was inside getting ready for church. Now, Lori may have been trying to protect her roommate, but the man didn't hesitate. He squeezed Lori's neck even tighter until she passed out and dropped to the ground. He then slid her body under the stairs, took her keys, and walked to the apartment that she had pointed to, just like he had belonged there. He unlocked the door and walked right into the apartment, and that's when he saw Melinda. But Melinda didn't hesitate. She called out for Lori, confused, until the man grabbed her and told her if she screamed, he'd kill her. He then shoved her into the bedroom and started strangling her. But Melinda did something smart. She didn't fight back and she didn't scream. Instead, she made herself go limp and played unconscious. The man tied her ankles with a belt. Then he used a wire hanger to tie her wrists behind her back. Then he went back outside. He grabbed Lori from under the stairs and dragged her to her apartment. He pulled her into the bathroom and started turning on the water and filling up the tub. But y'all, Melinda was smart because she was still awake and she was still watching. And she saw how when he dragged Lori inside, he began to clap his hands and giggle like he was happy with himself. And that's when Melinda knew if she stayed, she was gonna die. So while the man focused on Lori, Melinda worked her way free, just enough to move. She untied herself and then ran to the sliding glass door in her room. She opened it, and without hesitation, she jumped from the second-story balcony onto the concrete. In a later interview, she would say if she was going to die, she'd rather die on her own terms than by his hands. And even though that fall probably hurt like hell, Melinda was determined not to die. She then ran to a neighbor's apartment where she saw a woman sitting outside drinking coffee, and she immediately called the police. Now, when the police pulled up, the man was still inside, and he was in the process of drowning Lori in the bathtub. But when he went back to check on Melinda, he saw she was gone. And when he looked outside the balcony, that's when he saw the two police cruisers parked outside. And with too much to lose, he ran. He flew down the stairs past the officers, and while one chased him on foot, the other called for backup. Meanwhile, a neighbor went inside the apartment and found Lori in the tub. They pulled her out and they started CPR. Lori started coughing up water and started breathing again. Meanwhile, outside, The man was trying to make a run for it to his car, but it was a dead end. An officer pulled up with a gun and ordered him to the ground. The man complied, he hit the ground, and was expeditiously taken into custody. And that's when the police finally got his name. This man was Carl Eugene Watts. A man by the name of Carl Eugene Watts was now sitting in a Houston police interrogation room, and detectives were starting to piece things together, and quickly. And that's when they realized that this wasn't just a random attack, and this man wasn't no spring chicken either. Because you see, what they had sitting in front of them was a man who had been killing women for almost 10 years now. Carl Eugene Watts was born November 7th, 1953 in Killeen, Texas. His parents, Richard and Dorothy Mae Watts, were married only a year earlier in West Virginia. Because you see, Richard was in the military and he was stationed at Fort Hood, which is how they ended up in Texas. However, a few days after Carl was born, his family moved back to Coalwood, West Virginia. And a year later, they had a daughter named Sharon. And not long after that, Richard just up and left. No explanation, just left his family. But Dorothy did what she did best, and she packed up her and her 2 kids and moved to Inkster, Michigan, just outside of Detroit. She got a job as a high school art teacher, and she did what she could to raise her 2 kids on her own. But when Carl would go back to West Virginia to visit his grandma and his cousins, that's how he got the nickname Coral, because he liked their southern drawl and the way they would drawl out Coral instead of Carl. He liked the way it sounded. So when he would go back home, he would tell his mom and all his friends to call him Coral. And from then on, that's what everybody called him. Now, school didn't really come easy for Coral because he struggled a little bit. But he did manage to get decent grades early on. Well, at least that was until 1961 when he was about 8 years old and everything changed. Because both he and his sister came down with meningitis. And Dorothy did take both of them to Detroit General, but Sharon was the only one that was admitted. There's no clear explanation as to why Coral wasn't. However, it said that Sharon had bacterial meningitis and she recovered quickly. Now, Coral was taken to another hospital and his condition worsened. And that's when doctors realized that he also had polio. So between the 2 illnesses, he missed almost all of the 3rd grade. And after that, his performance in school never really bounced back. And once he came home, he complained that he couldn't really remember things like he used to. But things just kept moving along in life because Dorothy remarried and her new man was a mechanic by the name of Norman Caesar. But y'all, Norman already had 6 kids on his own. And together, he and Dorothy had 2 more. So that made 10 kids in this one house. So Coral started to get a little lost in the mix. And it said that he did get a little bit quieter and more withdrawn. But his sister did say that there was no physical or sexual abuse in the home. But Carl did keep things bottled up. But it did take a lot to upset him. And when he finally did snap, all hell would break loose. It would be like the floodgates just opened up. And although academics weren't his strong suit, he leaned heavily on sports. Football, track, basketball. And in track, he ran the 100-yard hurdles. And the boy even boxed too, and he was pretty good at it. He went on to win a middleweight Golden Glove title, but Carl couldn't really handle losing. And his first time he got knocked out, he quit boxing altogether. But then all of a sudden, as a teenager, his behavior shifted. Because you see, he had himself a little paper route to earn a little extra money. And on June 25th, 1969, while he was out delivering papers, he knocked on the door of one of his regulars, little old 60-year-old Joanne Gave. And when she opened the door, to her surprise, he started punching her, and punching her hard, over and over again. And then, within a blink of an eye, he just stopped and ran off. And what's crazy is he didn't even leave the area. He just kept on delivering papers like nothing had happened, and he went home just like any other regular day. But 4 days later, the police showed up at his house and arrested him. And in that moment, now that was the first clear sign of what Coral was becoming. Now, when he was arrested and questioned and asked why he did what he did, his response was simple. He just felt like beating somebody up. So with that, he was admitted to the Lafayette Medical Clinic in Detroit, and he was evaluated by a psychiatrist. Here is where he would tell the doctor that he had dreams about beating up women and even killing them. And he said that he always felt better after having one of those dreams. But after weeks of evaluation, the doctor suggested that the boy was an impulsive individual who had a passive-aggressive orientation on life. He expressed some confusion in thinking when situations become complex. The doctor would also go on to say that Coral was a paranoid young man who was struggling for control for strong homicidal impulses. His behavioral controls are faulty, and there's a high potential for violent acting out. This individual is considered dangerous. And with all of that being said, the doctor went ahead and recommended outpatient treatment and released him, because why the hell not? So now Coral was released and he was free to do as he pleased. And well, from 1969 to 1974, Coral would go back to Lafayette Medical Clinic for outpatient treatment less than 10 times. However, he wasn't getting no treatment. He was just in there experimenting with all the drugs. But let's not forget, he's still in high school. But his mom helped him out as much as she could with his schoolwork. And with that, he was able to graduate from high school. But y'all, shockingly, he got a football scholarship from Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. But he injured his knee before he could ever even play in a single game. So he dropped out of college just 3 months later. From there, he returned to Michigan and he enrolled in an engineering program at Western Michigan University. And he lived on campus and worked in the cafeteria. But y'all, the freedom that living on campus gave him was everything he needed to dream up new ways of harming women. On October 25th, 1974, Coral knocked on the door of WMU student Lenore Nazaki. And when she answered the door, she was smart and kept the chain secured. But Carl, on the other end of the door, asked if Charles was home. But she's like, no, you must have the wrong address. So he ends up turning away and leaving. But 10 minutes later, he returns and asks for Charles again. But Lenore went ahead and offered to take a message for Charles. So she unhooked the chain, and just as she turned to grab a piece of paper and a pen, Carl bum-rushed the door and knocked her to the floor. He pinned his knee in her chest and began strangling her. And soon, she lost consciousness. She would say in a later interview that she could barely see him walking away as everything turned black. He left her there and just walked away. A few days later, tenants at a different apartment complex complained that they saw Coral lurking around the complex, knocking on different doors, asking for Charles. But then, on October 30th, 1974, Coral was walking up the stairs to 19-year-old student Gloria Steele's apartment. And there was actually a witness that watched him knock on the door, and when Gloria asked through the door what he wanted, he said, "I'm looking for Charles." And she asked, "Why are you here?" And then he responded, "I don't know," before turning around and walking back down the stairs. Later that day, around 1:40 p.m., Gloria's body was discovered inside of her apartment. She had been stabbed 33 times in the chest. Now, many people would report that it was a screwdriver that was used, but it was actually a wood carving tool, more like a chisel, and the tip of it had broken off and lodged in her spine. So by now, it's safe to say that Coral wasn't just having these dreams anymore. An autopsy report revealed that Gloria had a crushed windpipe. Now, thankfully, she hadn't been sexually assaulted, so it shows that the crime wasn't sexually motivated, and nothing from her apartment had been taken. So it wasn't a robbery. This was just straight rage killing. So during the investigation, detectives claimed that Gloria's family members actually cleaned up the crime scene and moved her body, destroying vital evidence. But the family denied this, of course. To this day, nobody knows what happened inside of that apartment after her death. There's no solid proof that the family moved anything, but there's also no solid proof that the killer didn't try to clean up after himself either. But the police did say that that's probably one of the reasons why there's no physical evidence tying anyone to this crime. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 12th, 23-year-old Diane Williams was working as an apartment manager in the same complex where she lived, and she noticed a man walking around knocking on doors asking for someone named Charles, and eventually he ended up at her door. And just like Lenore had done before her, Diane suggested that he leave a message, and when she reached to hand him a piece of paper and a pen, that's when he snatched the paper out of her hand and forced his way inside. Once inside, he started strangling her, but Diane fought back with everything she had. And then all of a sudden, her phone started ringing, and she was able to knock the receiver off the hook. And thankfully, on the other end of the line was her husband's secretary, and she heard everything, which scared Coral off. Diane watched from the window as he jumped into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix and drove away. So immediately she called the police and gave them the car's description. So detectives put together a lineup of 8 men who matched the physical description and drove the same type of car. And both Diane and Lenore picked out Coral Watts from that lineup. So he was arrested and charged with both assaults. And he admitted that he was in the area when Gloria Steele was murdered, but he denied killing her. He even volunteered to take a polygraph test. But he eventually changed his mind and asked for a lawyer. So the test was never conducted. And unfreaking believably, he was released that very same day while the investigation continued. But in December, police searched his place, and here is where they found carving tools. But of course, none that could be directly matched to Gloria's murder weapon. Now, before the trial for the assaults on Diane and Lenore could start, Coral was evaluated again at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Ann Arbor. And the doctor would go on to say that he was competent enough to stand trial, and he wrote this: "The patient is clearly dangerous, and his potential for relapse behavior is great." Now, Carl did go on to plead no contest to the assault charges, and for that he received a 1-year jail sentence. But when he got out, he moved back to Inkster and he lived with his mom and his stepdad. And it didn't take him long to meet a young woman by the name of Dolores Howard. They would go on to have a daughter together. However, Carl wouldn't support her in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Hell, he wouldn't even claim her as his, and he eventually just disappeared. But what Dolores didn't know was that Carl's raggedy self had already married another woman about 6 months after the baby was born. So in August of 1979, Carl married Valeria Goodwill after meeting her at a disco club. But y'all, it didn't take Valeria long at all to realize that she made a mistake with this man, because he ended up getting fired from his job as a mechanic. And do y'all think he bothered to go out and look for another job? Hell no. He was very erratic, messy, and unpredictable. And she would later say that after they would have sex, he would often leave the house and be gone for hours at a time. But what she didn't know is that during these late night disappearances, Coral was actually breaking into women's homes, and women started reporting waking up in the dark with a man standing over them, touching them, but none of them could clearly identify him. And within a year, Valeria ended up leaving him. But that didn't seem to matter to Coral because this just freed up more time for him. And with that, he went on a full-fledged killing spree that lasted the next 2 years. On October 8th, 1979, 22-year-old Peggy Pugmera was found strangled to death in the front yard near her boyfriend's place. And then, on October 31st, 44-year-old Jean Klein was stabbed 13 times and left outside of her home. And people walked past her body all night long, thinking that it was just Halloween decorations. And then, about a month later, a man by the name of Joseph Foy looked out of his window and saw 36-year-old Helen Dutcher struggling with the man before he slashed and stabbed her 12 times. Joseph called the police and later helped put together a composite sketch. And y'all, get this. The composite sketch looked a hell of a lot like Coral Watts. But by the 80s, a pattern had started forming, and some of the murders were happening on early Sunday mornings. On April 20th, 17-year-old Shirley Small was found on a sidewalk near her home. She had one single stab wound straight to her heart and 6 cuts across her face. Then on July 13th, 26-year-old Glenda Richmond was found dead right in front of her apartment door. She had been stabbed 28 times in the chest with a screwdriver. On September 14th, 20-year-old Rebecca Huff was found outside of her apartment complex. She had been stabbed 54 times using the same type of weapon, a screwdriver. And because these killings kept landing on Sundays, despite several others happening on different days, the Ann Arbor Press decided to give the killer a name. And this is how and when they decided to come up with the Sunday Morning Slasher. However, even after receiving that name, on October 6, 1980, which just happened to be a Monday, Sandra Delp was walking home from night school in Windsor, Ontario, when a man that matched Coral's description attacked her in the street. He stabbed her multiple times in the back and slashed her face. But she was still alive, and she was able to watch him run off and jump into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. And U.S. Customs later confirmed that his car crossed back into the U.S. at 2:25 a.m. the following morning. Then he struck again on November 1st. 30-year-old Mary Angus was almost home when he rushed her. But she turned around and screamed as loud as she could. And it worked. It scared him off and he ran away. But once again, U.S. Customs recorded his vehicle crossing back into the U.S. around 1:07 a.m., barely 30 minutes after the attack happened. But then, 5 days later, he came back with a vengeance. And this time, there were no survivors. 63-year-old Lena Bennett was found hanging in her garage, suspended by a trench coat. She was naked and had been sexually assaulted by a broom handle. And this was the first known sexual assault tied to Coral. And only a couple days later, on November 15th, Coral was following a young woman in his car. But she noticed him, so she doubled back to try to lose him. But he flipped his car around quick as can be and kept on pursuing her. But she was able to run into an apartment building and disappear. But Carl was pissed he didn't get the attack for the night. So he jumped out of his car furious, looking for her in the dark. But what he didn't know was that 2 patrol officers were watching him the entire time. And by the time he made it back to his car, there they were. But Buddy wasn't taking no chances, so he immediately took off running. But during the chase, he was able to double back and jump into his car. But when he tried to speed away, he got caught. But y'all, they only arrested him for expired tags and driving with a suspended license. But when they searched his car, they found a dictionary with the name Rebecca carved into the cover. And if y'all remember, Rebecca Huff had been murdered just 2 months earlier. But in his car, they also found wood carving tools and blood. And the moment detectives walked into the interrogation room to question him, Coral asked for a lawyer. And once again, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. So once again, he was released back to the streets. But this time, they stayed on him, and they had heavy surveillance watching him for 24 hours a day if they could. And it was during this surveillance that it's believed that he attempted another attack in Ontario. But luckily, the woman scared him off, and once again, there was nothing to tie him back to that crime. And eventually, he realized that he was being watched, so he just started to stay home more. And police thought they were doing something by putting a tracker on his car, but this didn't lead to anything solid. But y'all, one thing they did notice was that within those 2 months when he was under surveillance, the attack stopped, which told them everything they needed to know. So with that, the investigators brought him back down to the station for another interrogation, but this man wasn't saying a damn word. So they decided to switch tactics and just stay on him with heavy pressure. They would just pop up on him at random times. Hey, Coral, you ready to talk? Come talk to us. Come on now. They would even follow this man around the grocery store. They made sure that he knew that he was being watched. But I guess he had had enough of being harassed by the police, because on March 10th, 1981, this was the last day anyone saw him in Michigan for a very long time. He didn't even tell his mama he was leaving. He just packed up his stuff and disappeared. He skipped town and went back to West Virginia, first to see his grandmama and to ask her for some money. And then after a few days, he left and made his way down to Houston. This is where he found himself a job working as a mechanic at a coastal transport company. But once he made himself enough money, he eventually went back up to Michigan, but this was just to get his car, and then he dipped out again. But the Michigan detectives apparently knew exactly where he was, and they went ahead and sent a 19-page report on this man to the Houston Police Department. So Houston was tracking exactly who he was, and he was immediately on their radar. But he didn't spend long in Houston before he decided to move to Columbus, which was about 70 miles west. And eventually, the Houston police just stopped actively watching him. Well, all except for one man, and that was Detective Doug Bostick. He would go and check in on Coral whenever he could. You know, what you up to, dude? What you been doing? You been killing anybody? But Houston just didn't have the manpower, because in the 80s, Houston was actually being called the murder capital of the world, which was a title ironically taken from Detroit. So if Coral wanted to disappear in a sea of violence, he sure knew how to pick the perfect cities. On September 5th, 1981, Coral decided that he was done laying low, and he was back on the prowl. He started following a young woman driving through Houston, and this just so happened to be 22-year-old Linda Tilley. She was an art student studying at the University of Texas in Austin, and all she was trying to do was make her way back to her apartment, making that about 2.5, 3-hour drive from Houston to Austin. But what she didn't know was that Coral was following her the entire time. And as soon as she pulled up to her apartment, he jumped out of his car and grabbed her from behind. But Linda wasn't going down without a fight. She was fighting back with everything she had, and they eventually struggled into the apartment complex pool. And from there, Carl was able to hold her underwater until she drowned. Afterwards, he simply hopped out of the pool, jumped in his car, and drove all the way back home. Linda's body was found the next day floating in the pool. She was still fully clothed and there was no sign of a struggle. However, a toxicology report showed that she had been drinking, so the police ruled it an accidental drowning. And this man clearly just didn't give a damn, because just 5 days after killing Linda, Carl went to a church service and he found himself a little girlfriend by the name of Sheila Williams. And just 3 days after that, just after midnight, Carl attacked another woman. He stabbed 25-year-old Elizabeth Montgomery in the chest, killing her. And less than 30 minutes later, 30 more fucking minutes, he followed another woman home from the grocery store just a few miles away. And this was 22-year-old Susie Wolf. As she walked from her car to her apartment, Carl grabbed her and stabbed her 9 times in the chest and then disappeared into the night. Susie died right there on the pavement. And as all of this is going on, Detective Doug is still trying to keep a track on Carl. But this got even harder after he got himself a new car. I guess he wanted to switch things up because in October of 1981, he paid cash for a blue 1976 Dodge van. And then about a month later, I guess Detective Doug thought he was doing something because he managed to put a tracker on Carl's old Pontiac. But Carl found it and quickly removed that thing. But on January 4th, 1982, 27-year-old Ellen Tam went out for her usual 3-mile run around Rice University. Another jogger would see her running around 6:15 a.m. And only an hour and a half later, her body was found hanging from a low tree branch using her own tank top. And because there was no clear signs of a struggle, her death was ruled a homicide. But her family wasn't going for that one bit, so they pushed the medical examiner to reconsider. And eventually he changed the report, writing that the evidence pointed towards either a freak accident or a clever, cunning, opportunistic homicide. Boy, what the hell is you talking about? But y'all get this, because in January alone, Carl killed 2 more women and stabbed another 3. And on the same day as one of those murders, he also slit a young woman's throat, but she too survived. So Buddy was really out here just careless. But on March 27th, Carl attacked again, and twice that day. The first attack was on 34-year-old Anne Ledette. She had left her home around 4:30 a.m. to go for a jog, and Carl grabbed her and stabbed her 17 times in the chest, killing her. And not long after that, while still covered in Anne's blood, he saw another woman by the name of Glenda Kirby. As she walked down the street, he tried to grab her, but the blood from Anne was still on his hands and he couldn't get a grip, so she was able to break free and get away. Now, she did call the police, but she wasn't able to give them much of a description. But this man will go on to attack 3 more women in March and 3 more in April. But then on May 22nd, a woman by the name of Michelle Day had been out drinking, and she caught Carl's attention. So he followed her home. And as she walked towards her apartment, Carl came up behind her. And she must have sensed something because she turned around, and just as she was about to say something, he grabbed her by the neck and strangled her until she lost consciousness. He took her house keys, unlocked the door, and then laid her on the living room floor. He stripped her naked and then carried her into the bathroom. He put her in the bathtub, plugged the drain, and then filled it up with water until it covered her head. He would later tell police that he did this so that her spirit wouldn't escape. And y'all, that very next day brings us to when he tried to kill Lori Lister that exact same way. And that brings us back to the beginning on how he was caught in the act. Now, although he was caught in the act, and this should have been what seemed like an open and shut case, the prosecutor didn't believe that they had enough evidence to make the murder charges stick for all the other cases, because too much time had passed and there wasn't enough physical evidence. So instead, they offered him a deal. So he pled guilty to aggravated burglary and attempted murder, and in exchange to that, he would confess who his other victims were. Man, hell no. Ain't no way they offered him that deal. But on the other hand, Michigan refused to take any part in that deal. They said any crime this man confessed to in our state, we plan to prosecute him to the fullest. And y'all, no victims' families were even notified or consulted before this deal was even signed. But by the time it hit the news, Houston was furious. But it didn't seem to matter anymore because the deal was made. So with that, Carl would go on to confess to 12 murders, snug as a bug in his immunity blanket. So he was sentenced to the maximum of 60 years with the possibility of parole after 20. That's crazy. But y'all, in 1983, this idiot made an attempt to escape prison, but he didn't get far. But for this little attempt, this earned him 15 days in the hole. He lost his good credit time, and he was also transferred to a higher security unit. However, part of his sentence said that he wasn't eligible for good time because he was classified as a violent offender. But listen how the law just plays, okay? Because the Court of Appeals ruled that Carl didn't qualify as a violent offender because he didn't use a weapon. But the prosecutor tried to argue that the bathtub water should count as a deadly weapon. But the court said no. So because of that ruling, his violent offender status was lifted. And in 2002, Carl was given a scheduled release date of May 8th, 2006. But the state of Texas said, hell no, this man is not about to be walking our streets a free man. So they decided to make a quick decision, and in order to keep him off the streets, the governor signed extradition papers to send him back to Michigan to stand trial for the murder of Helen Dutcher. And this is the murder when there was actually a witness by the name of Joseph Foy. You remember the one that came up with the composite sketch that looked exactly like him? And because they had a witness, they were confident that they would convict Carl for this crime. So he was extradited back to Michigan, where he was convicted of the murder of Helen Dutcher. And on November 17th, 2004, he was sentenced to life in prison. And 3 years later, he was back in the court because he was tried and convicted for the 1974 murder of Gloria Steele. But y'all, get this. I promise you, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this. So I looked at a picture of his face and he looked like an elbow scab, okay? So we just going to call him elbow scab face ass dude. This idiot died of prostate cancer in prison exactly 2 months later on September 21st, 2007 at the age of 53. And cousins, just like that, that's the end of this week's case. The system is hella dumb, especially when it comes to these serial killers. Because not only was he not tried and convicted for all of the murders that he did, he was only convicted of 2, 3 of them? And then the other ones he was let off with being charged with assaults and then getting plea deals? Man, come on now. But cousins, I hope y'all enjoyed this week's case on the serial killer dubbed the Sunday Morning Slasher, but also known as Raggedy, Elbow Scab Face Ass, Carl Eugene Watts. But I'll see y'all back here same place, same time next week.